Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 89 and I am the show's host, Kyle. I have a kind of exciting show, I think, to talk about today. I got some new stuff I'm going to get to at least by the middle of the show, but I kind of want to start off the show just by talking about why this war issue is so important and why I'm dedicating so much of my time and so many of my listeners dedicate their time to learning about it, speaking to friends and family about it, and just overall being involved in the movement to get the United States and countries all over the world, not just the United States, but primarily the United States, NATO, and Western allies to stop waging so much war, carrying out so many acts of imperialism, and generally making the world a worse place to live rather than a better place to live. On top of foreign policy being something that I am just generally interested in, I think it also has a lot to do with the fact that as an American, I, have a job and I pay taxes. And while I may not make a whole lot of money, I do make some money, and the government does take some of that money and uses a portion of that money to go ahead and either subsidize weapon making that will be used by the United States and allied forces to kill people around the world, or it'll go directly to producing a bomb, which an American pilot will fly over Iraq and drop that bomb and it'll land on a house with a couple of babies in it, and that's really messed up. When you look at the actual totality of what American foreign policy and Western foreign policy and imperialism and intervention from all countries, from the United States to Russia to China to any South American country, even trying to exert pressure on its neighbors or on the other people in the world to influence that country in a way that a different country would prefer it would go, and trying to make a population do something that population doesn't want to do. It just continues to plague this planet and cause so much absolute catastrophe, and the level to which it occurs is unimaginable to the level that I think it gets ignored, because if you look at, what's really going on the face of it, it's so terrible and horrific that it seems like it has to be fake. Like, these kind of things don't happen. But right now, I mean, just look at it. We have Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump playing the world's most high stakes game of chicken ever. You have Mattis coming out and saying that any North Korean threat will be met with a massive military force or massive military intervention. Just basically Mattis saying again that, look, if North Korea does anything, we're going to do a lot to wipe them out. And he even goes on to say, look, our goal isn't to annihilate the North Korean state, but it's at the same time, it's once they do something, then we're going to wipe them out. Now, of course, what's happened between the United States and the North Korea and all other related countries is a downward spiral in the relationship. They continue to do things that are slightly more excessive than what they've been willing to do in the past, to just show how much North Korea is, how serious they are and how much they mean it. This is a game of chicken, right? You're trying to force the other side to flinch, and both sides are saying, well, we are absolutely not going to do it. And so the end threat here, that what's at the end of this road we're going down, is hydrothermic nuclear war. It means dropping hydrogen bombs on North Korea, and North Korea at least attempting to respond by hitting other countries, I'm guessing South Korea, the United States, or Japan, with either H-bombs or A-bombs that they have made themselves. And so we're no longer talking about just the type of war that gets a few 100,000 people or maybe 1 million people killed. We're talking about tens, if not hundreds of millions into billions of people. The environmental destruction that using these weapons have will be, something that I don't think people could really calculate or measure. Khan Hallinan has talked about how any type of nuclear war between India and Pakistan would result in destruction of the ozone layer to the extent that the earth may cool so much that you really can't grow wheat in Russia and Canada. And this would, of course, lead to a lot of starvation around the world, because without so much wheat on the market, then the price of calories goes up. And when the price of calories goes up, it really hurts the people who, spend all their money on food. And so what that kind of intervention in military, war would do between the United States and North Korea is really unknown. Would obviously depend on what kind of weapons the North Koreans have and how many get used. But just looking at the U.S. is going to have to drop several hydrogen bombs on North Korea if that's the war it comes down to. North Korea has several missile sites, several nuclear weapons facilities, and all this stuff will have to be destroyed. The North Koreans have a 1 million man army, so it seems kind of unrealistic to think that, we would be able to maybe march in there and secure these sites. We can maybe try a reverse Red Dawn and, paratrooper all of our troops in and try to secure these sites, but who knows what could happen here. However, it does seem that the United States would have to use several hydrogen weapons if it came down to war between the United States and North Korea. And who knows how the North Korean people are going to react themselves. If the United States starts dropping hydrogen bombs on North Korea, they may not be so friendly. And, not only are you fighting the Kim Jong-un army, you're fighting the entire North Korean population. Like her counterpart in the Defense Department, Nikki Haley, who is the U.S. ambassador to the UN, former governor, I believe, of South Carolina, is saying that North Korea is begging for war, which, definitely seems not to be the case here. The United States and Russia spent years and years, 70 plus years, saying that the reason they needed to develop, bigger and better nuclear weapons was to deter war, not have it break out. And I think the North Koreans see what they're doing in a very similar light. Now, I'm 100% and always will be against nuclear proliferation. It seems like, as I've said on the podcast before, just a really stupid thing to do to to build these weapons that can only kill millions of civilians. These aren't weapons that ever make sense to use on a battlefield or in that kind of scenario. It's to wipe out the entire city. North Korea wants to destroy all of Tokyo or LA, or the United States wants to annihilate all of Pyongyang. Either way, this isn't meant to inflict a military defeat against an opponent. They're meant to inflict a moral and civilian and just horrific experience on the opponent. This is one of the things that when you look into and talk about even the use of the very small atomic weapons the United States used in Japan during World War II, everybody talks about, how it ended the war and it scared the Japanese into surrendering. It was like, yeah, but it required the deaths of hundreds of civilians, thousands of civilians to do it. Imagine if the United States took a portion of Japan with about 100,000 civilians in it, and they just walked up to every single one of the civilians, pointing a gun at the back of their head, men, women, children, elderly, put a baby infant right next to the baby's great grandmother and shoot both of them in the head. And you would say, wow, that's a horrific thing to do and it's extremely ugly. But this is what happened when we dropped the nuclear bombs. And so these weapons are completely nonsensical. They can't do anything to help you win a military victory. It's just all about scaring the opponent into submission. And it seems ridiculous that anybody would have ever built all these weapons, but we have them now. South Korea, part of their response to the North Korean hydrogen bomb test was to carry out their own simulated missile strike against North Korea. From my understanding, a simulated missile strike is kind of just a missile test, because they shoot off this missile just like the North Koreans do it. They're testing a missile. I guess maybe one of the differences is the South Koreans are more confident that their missile's gonna work than the North Koreans are, but at the same time, they're, I'm sure learning from this and figuring stuff out to make it a more precision strike when they actually carry it out. And so while everybody's all up in arms about North Korea testing it in ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons, nobody cares when South Korea does it. In fact, the media does their best to whitewash the story by calling it something else. I think the real practical changes that will come about because North Korea has hydrogen bombs is we're going to see the U.S. lift the caps on the missile payloads that it sells to Japan and South Korea. This seems to just mean that the United States is going to give South Korea and Japan bigger and better weapons. I'm not sure what the practical implications of this are as far as it goes as war against North Korea. All these weapons are in the area anyways with the United States, and if, war with North Korea is ever talked about, it's not Japan and South Korea doing a whole lot to fight against the North Koreans. It's the Americans and their A-bombs and their missile defense systems and their F-35s and 11 aircraft carriers. And so, I guess this would mean that some of the money used to blow up North Korea wouldn't come from the American citizens, it would come from the Japanese or South Korean civilians. two of the best takes on kind of where we go from here with North Korea. One's from Justin Raimondo, who is, of course, a writer with antiwar.com. Anybody who's interested in learning any of the stuff that I talk about, number one resource is antiwar.com. Go there, read Justin. He always has great insights and everything into this war stuff. Raimondo talked about how Trump is looking to move away from its the United States free trade agreement with South Korea, which apparently benefits the South Korean economy at the expense of the American economy. Raimondo says this will be a good thing because it would move the United States alliance with South Korea away from South Korea, and then goes back to some of Trump's campaign rhetoric where he talked about the United States subsidizing the defense of all these countries. And at one time or another, I guess Trump either specifically alluded to South Korea or actually said that the United States is subsidizing the defense of South Korea. And I think this actually created a lot of buzz and alarm in the media. Raimondo argues that the United States moving away from its alliance with South Korea would create a situation where the North Koreans have less reason to be hostile in the region. If you ever listen to the North Korean rhetoric, it typically comes off as any attack against South Korea or Japan would be an attack in response to America. It's about what America is doing, and South Korea and Japan are the closest places that North Korea could hurt the United States and, the quote-unquote West if it doesn't actually have the technology to hit Guam or an actual U.S., Alaska, Hawaii, whatever, with a nuclear weapon. Well, the current South Korean president has actually made some attempts to, want to negotiate with North Korea and wants to reinstitute policies like the Sunshine Policy, which was a policy that was supposed to bring the Korean people closer together, but fell apart as North Korea developed nuclear weapons, and generally saying that he wants to get along with North Korea. So without the United States pressure and constant flying of B-1B nuclear-capable bombers over the demilitarized zone, we could see the South Koreans maybe make some notable diplomatic gains with the North Koreans without the U.S. involvement. I think once the United States withdraws, South Korea and Japan, have a lot of weapons, they have a lot of money, and both countries, while they've relied on the American defense, they could fight their own war against the North Koreans. I think at least enough to be a deterrence to North Korea. Remember, you have a pretty wide dispute or discrepancy in the amount of power that an opposing country has to be able to deter it from attacking. I think you just have to be able to inflict a notable loss on the other country. Also, North Korea knows that it would really isolate itself from its last remaining ally in China if it would ever aggressively start a war with another country. The point was also made, and I think this was in the Raimondo article, but maybe in the Nets article I talk about, and that was that if the United States does launch a preemptive attack against North Korea, which has at least vaguely threatened to do several times, that attack is going to be a surprise attack. The United States isn't going to notify North Korea, hey, we're coming in 3 days with our B-1B nuclear-capable bombers, and we have a couple submarines off the coast, and we're going to launch nuclear weapons from there. What's going to be is one day we're going to have these nuclear-capable bombers flying near the demilitarized zone in South Korea, and they're going to make a turn north, and then they're going to go and they're going to drop bombs on the South Korean or North Korean nuclear facilities and missile sites. Probably the presidential or whatever palace that Kim Jong-un has, and maybe some civilian sites as well. And so every time those bombers fly over that area, the North Korean regime has to be on alert and guard, waiting for those planes to turn north. And so the U.S. exiting the region would take away that constant threat and that constant problem. There's also a very interesting article published on War on the Rots. The article goes through in details about just kind of what the reality of the world is now that North Korea has a hydrogen bomb and at least poses some probability of having the missile capable of reaching the continental United States. I've often expressed skepticism and have tended to side with the McAdams and Ron Paul position that North Korea's nuclear capabilities and missile capabilities are probably a little overblown. But if we look at maybe even just what the consensus position is today, that the media tells us, which is that North Korea has a missile that could reach the United States and North Korea has a hydrogen bomb, that really changes the relationship here, because the United States has admitted that at best their missile defense systems are kind of flip a coin. And so if there's a hydrogen bomb headed towards, let's say, LA, you're looking at the potential death of 10 million people or so, and the United States has to now factor that in anytime it considers launching any kind of attack against North Korea. One of the things I didn't realize, but was a point made, I believe, in the War on the Rocks article, was that North Korea's latest missile test, which was the one that was conducted very early in the morning over northern Japan, was a surprise test, and I guess a lot of people actually didn't see it coming in that North Korea was also, kind of flexing its muscle, saying, hey, we have this confidence in our missiles and we've achieved new missile technology. They were also making the point of how quickly they could, set up and fire a missile, and that, increases the threat that you have from North Korea. And so the reality of the world is that North Korea can hit LA with a hydrogen bomb, then the United States really doesn't have a military option in North Korea. I really struggle to find any incentive for the United States to put the lives of 12 million or so of their civilians at risk in exchange for whatever interest they have in North Korea, especially when the less hawkish people, the South Koreans, are the ones that are saying, we're not sure about this war more than anyone else. Another aspect of war that I think gets covered up in the consequences of it are so unimaginable and just so terrible that a lot of times it's disbelief or we don't talk about it. I came across this meme, and it was from, I think, an Antifa site or something like that. And it was just going on and listing all these numbers of people who are starving to death and dying every year. And, the meme blames it on capitalism, but I'm going to set aside that debate and just kind of talk about where a lot of these deaths are actually coming from. A lot of these deaths are occurring because governments around the world, whether it be the United States, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt, any European, Russian country, the Myanmar government, the Chinese government has carried out imperialist style military campaigns in the past, and they square off with India every now and then, and so there's a lot of problems with all these countries. But one of the effects is that anytime the war breaks out, then you can't get aid to the people, and so when those people are isolated, like look at the people in North Korea who we in the past decade or two had a major up to I think 100,000 or so North Koreans starved to death. Right now in Yemen we have 7 million plus people starving to death, another 300,000 contracting cholera. Somalia, the similar numbers to Yemen, where you have 7 million people that are going to starve to death. And these people aren't starving to death because there's a lack of food, because there's a lack of aid, because people don't have the money or the ability to help. It's that they can't help, and there's several reasons for this. The most common seems to be, some kind of war. In Yemen, Saudi Arabia is not allowing humanitarian ships to reach the shores of Yemen because they think it'll hurt them in their campaign to kind of besiege and take out the Houthis and install a Saudi-friendly government in Yemen. And while this happens, there's, thousands of babies, hundreds of thousands of people of the total population that are going to starve to death throughout this process. And so those, numbers can't be attributed to capitalism, but they can certainly be attributed to interventionist foreign policies. This would not be going on if the United States wasn't backing Saudi Arabia in their war against Yemen. If you look at the plight of the Palestinian people, especially the people in Gaza, who, many of them are dying way too young, of way too preventable diseases because the Israelis don't let them get to the doctor they need. The destabilization in Libya that created slave trade, rape state, and thousands of other different catastrophes. In South Sudan, you have ethnic cleansing and starving going on. In Nigeria, you have a massive amount of starvation going on. All these countries have an oppressive government trying to intervene in their neighboring states. There's some nuance in the Israeli-Palestinian situation. And this is what's causing all these deaths. And these deaths are completely preventable. You could just tell the United States to stop doing it. We have no interest in Iraq. We have no interest in Syria. It's not going to make the Americans safer to arm up Syrian jihadists, let's be honest. It's not going to make Americans any safer to have another 1,000 American men go die in Afghanistan. It's not going to make Americans any safer to drop bombs on Libya or Somalia. It in no way will help the United States to starve 7 million Yemeni people to death and let another 100,000 vomit and poop themselves to death because of cholera. And so this is the important issue. This is why foreign policy is the important issue, is because of how many people can die because of it. Yeah, we could talk about Obamacare, and you could say that more people are going to die if they have less health insurance. And the other side can make other arguments. But one thing you really can't argue is that depriving the Yemeni people of food aid and even trade, it's not like the Yemeni people couldn't, if their country wasn't being bombed to pieces, produce enough goods to trade with the outside world to import some of their own food. Same, I'm sure, with the Somalis or the Libyans. But all these places, you can't bring the food in. And so the food sits offshore. Sometimes it goes bad sitting offshore, waiting to go in, waiting to feed hungry people. It's not because of greed. It's not, well, at least not greed because somebody is hoarding all the food. It's not because rich people aren't willing to go into their pockets to donate, or even, middle class or poor people willing to go in their pockets and donate money to help these relief efforts. It's because of military interventionism keeping these deaths, these people from getting the food and the aid they need. Just think of all the roads that have been destroyed in all these Middle Eastern countries by bombs. Once a bomb hits a road, it's very difficult to, cross that road. In some of these places, they bomb bridges, making travel impossible. And whenever you're deprived of the ability to travel, trade gets a lot more expensive, food gets a lot more expensive, medical care becomes more expensive and more difficult to access. If all the hospitals in your area have been bombed, or all the bridges in your village have been bombed, then it's kind of hard to get an ambulance to you. It's kind of hard to help you when you need aid the most. And so this is a situation that the United States and other countries are creating around the world. I brought up Myanmar. We now have 100,000 plus refugees. It looks like the government is fighting an absolute brutal war against these Muslim minorities. It does look like Moon of Alabama has a pretty good article. And if you guys don't know anything about Moon of Alabama, they're a great website. Just Google Moon of Alabama. I'm not sure if it's one guy that writes there or multiple. It's always listed under Moon of Alabama. But they publish excellent articles with deep insights on foreign policy. This article in particular talks about the links between Saudi Arabia and that Muslim minority population, and some funding and possible arming going to them there, and also the possible jihadist connections between that Muslim militia fighting against the Myanmar government soldiers. Moon of Alabama says that the leader is a known jihadist, somebody that's actually gone to Saudi Arabia and studied Wahhabism, and then there's about 1,000 other Muslim jihadist fighters in Myanmar. Well, it certainly complicates the situation in Myanmar. It just makes it more likely that both sides are committing, kind of humanitarian catastrophes. As I read more reports, it looks like it is accurate, and we're getting a pretty clear picture that the Myanmar soldiers are going to these Muslim villages. They're burning down everybody's buildings, and then they're shooting some people, maybe carrying out some executions. Several civilians who are able to flee these villages show up in hospitals in Bangladesh with, bullet wounds and broken bones. On the other side, that is for the Myanmar government soldiers, Israel plays a large role in arming that army and supporting that army. So ugliness on both sides. A couple other places where we see a lot of war just preventing any, humans from being able to live a decent life. And that is, if you look at the siege of Deir ez-Zor, that's actually coming to an end. But here we have a case in Syria. It's a pretty big city where ISIS has had a government held portion of the city under siege for the past 3 years. No, vehicles have been coming and able to supply. They've been living off of airdrops, but this is a really poor way to live and a really dangerous way to live. At one point, actually early in 2017, ISIS nearly took the last enclave that the Syrian Arab Army and Syrian government held in Deir ez-Zor. And that was, in some ways, assisted by a U.S. airstrike that I have one source that tells me was an actual mistake, and then I also have read Gareth Porter arguing that it may have been more intentional, and that was an airstrike on a key Syrian Arab Army position in Deir ez-Zor that was hit by a U.S. airstrike during a ceasefire in September of 2016. 80 Syrian soldiers died from the United States attack, and maybe some more died from ISIS when ISIS was able to then take the position. And through, I think, some pretty aggressive Russian airstrikes, the Syrian army has been able to hold their enclave of the city, and it looks like that siege is about to break. But just imagine living in that city. Take yourself there. Imagine spending, from the ages of 15 to 18, or even, raising 2 small children, or being an elderly person in a city under siege by ISIS for 3 years. What an insane thing to have to deal with and go through. I'm sure food and all types of services and care were very scarce. If you did any kind of work that required any imports, you were really kind of put out of work because they weren't able to import a whole lot of steel or anything like that into Deers, or, the only thing coming in were airdrops of probably food and guns. And, just a terrible, and, hundreds, if not thousands of the civilians there died of unnecessary causes. Maybe they died of diseases too early because the hospital didn't have the right medicine or whatever, or didn't have enough food, or were working in dangerous conditions because there were no other jobs available. But it does look like that siege is going to break. The Syrian Arab Army is approaching and may have already broken the siege, depending on what source you read. You get different information there. Another state that has been living under ISIS control for a while now is Raqqa, but it now seems like the SDF say they control 65% of the city, including the old city and the ancient mosque in Raqqa. Some photographic evidence seems to suggest the SDF forces are there, but the Pentagon has so far refused to make these confirmations. But think about a civilian living in Raqqa now. They have bombs raining down on their head every day from the Americans, artillery fire around the clock 24/7. You just spent 3 or 4 years, I guess, under control of ISIS, which meant, you could have your head chopped off for smoking, owning a cell phone, talking to any kind of outside sources will get you killed. Walking down the street, the wrong guy will get you killed. They kill people's families, so if they find out somebody's talking to a journalist, not only they kill you, they'll kill your entire extended family. These ISIS people are brutal, rough, a terrible place to live. I can't imagine spending any amount of your life in a country like that. And that is the most important issue, is to get as many people out of these absolute desperate and unnecessary situations as possible. Situations where it's only, some kind of outside force exerting itself on that's creating all these problems. And then just looking at what kind of silly things could bring about these most serious interventions. The Libya war was really started because Anne-Marie Slaughter was bored with her job at the State Department and saw an opportunity in Libya, and then decided to make a bigger deal about the issue, lie about Gaddafi going to slaughter 300,000 civilians in Benghazi. And so then we end up fighting a war that gets Muammar Gaddafi killed, and Libya becomes a state where they actually sell and trade slaves, and women get raped walking down the street all the time. It's a miserable, awful place to live, and it really didn't have to be that way. It was just because some woman who worked in the U.S. State Department got bored with her job and wanted a different one, and went out and created an opportunity for herself, and now we end up at war. If you look at Yemen, it's so stupid. We're only there to appease the Saudis because they were upset about America having better relations with Iran after the nuclear deal was signed. There's no real reason to fight a war in Yemen. The Houthis were no threat to the West, Saudi Arabia, or anyone really ever, until Saudi Arabia waged an aggressive war against the Houthis. Now, Saudi Arabia will probably have a Houthi problem for decades to come. And the same thing could very easily happen in Iran. I recently read an article that ran in the Atlantic, of all places, talking about how mistranslations have really hurt the Iran nuclear deal. I guess several times American and Western news sources have translated Iranian Farsi, language into a way that sounds more hawkish than it actually was. And things like that could really hurt the Iran nuclear deal and make it less popular in the United States. And so when you look at just the stupid things that could cause these absolutely terrible consequences where millions of people will die, right? And who knows how many millions of people will die in a war between the United States and Iran. But if we take away the Iran nuclear deal, that's one step closer to war. And if it happens because some journalist mistranslated some Iranian leader's quote, terrible that such a stupid thing could cause such a terrible consequence. Alright, I hope I didn't ramble and wasn't too tangential in that episode. I try to weave in some of the things I want to talk about with kind of just the consequences and the importance of war with the news stories going on the day. It's all relevant, it's all really important, and it all needs to be known by everybody. if we could get people to pay attention to the issue, that it's so clear that what's going on is so horrific, then we could get them to actually make a difference. People can change laws. Popular opinion can make a difference. So let people know. Tell them, say, hey, we gotta stop these wars. It's a nasty, ugly business, and it has to end now, or it's gonna end really badly for millions and millions of people. Alright, that'll do it for my show today. If everybody liked the show, please share the show. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com is the website. You can also go to the Facebook page, Kyle's Files. While you're there, like the page, share the show. I'm on iTunes. Like 5-star rating, review, subscribe to the show. That'd be great. Private Facebook group is Foreign Policy Focus. Twitter handle is at KYAAALE. And the personal website is kylesfilesblog.com. And I blog at thelibertarianinstitute.org.